on this beautiful and listening to this. It's kind of a show and tell and travel log of some of the adventures and misadventures I've had with QRP work over the years. And one just a little introductory comment. One of the great things I'm appreciating about our hobby is that it's such a broad range of things that can capture everyone's interest, from small little homemade things to big kind of mission control stations of giant contesting setups and all the technologies in between. And it's remarkable that people can find a little niche. And my little niche is QRP CW operation, and that's the focus of what this is tonight. So these are the main topics I'll talk about. So what's my radio DNA, if you will? Something about kite antennas, which figure into uh, numbers 3 and 4, which are two sort of mini expeditions to remote spots in Newfoundland, the island of Newfoundland, to do radio. And then information about a trip we had to Portugal, which was very fun and interesting and beautiful. And then the good with the bad, a disastrous radio trip to Martinique, and I described that. So I figure we had to have the plus and the minus there. And then the absolute best contact of my entire life, which was in Deep Cove this last February. So here we go. So my radio DNA, I was licensed in 1970, and my main interest at the time, absolute Christmas morning excitement, would be finding an old TV and scavenging every part out of it and trying to build this something like on the right here, which would be like a little tube transmitter on a cake tin. And two of my really strong guiding lights and inspirations were Charles Rocky, who's the guy on the left. He's an old World War II radio man who ended up writing a lot of articles on all sorts of things. He's prominent in the QRP literature, and he's in the QRP Hall of Fame. And Wes Hayward, who you'll recognize through many articles and books. And his thing that really grabbed me was the idea of making things, and all this little aluminum chassis out on the granite outcrops were really appealing to me. So the idea of making stuff and taking it outdoors to operate it, that was really appealing. So kite antennas, this is something that I'm only recently got into, and I've built and used them several times, and they're fabulously interesting. The main impetus was that where I lived in St. John's, Newfoundland, before I moved here, and by the way, Andy, it was last October, believe it or not, it
Okay.
was months ago. But I lived inside of Signal Hill, which, if you've been to St. John's in Newfoundland, is the uh, the tower where Marconi set up his kite in 1901 to receive sort of a half QSO, the letter S, sent by spark gap from Wales or Poldhu in England. And so that interested me in setting up a kite. And there's a whole subgenre of kite uses for antennas. And if you want to get into that, there's a real rabbit hole, and there's lots and lots of interesting articles and diagrams and so on to delve into. But the main aspect of kites. Oh, and by the way, just go back. Kites are mainly useful where obviously you don't have a lot of trees for two reasons. One, obviously, there's nothing to hook your antenna up to and unless you have a mast and some sort of way to get your antenna up in the air, there's really no way to get it higher than using a kite. So deserts, beaches, the tundra would be examples where kites are and have been used. And the issue of trees and other obstructions comes into it, as you'll see later. They can cause lots of weird weather or wind patterns, which disturb kite use. So big open flat areas like this are ideal. So the fundamental aspect of amateur radio kites and any radio kite is the sled kite, which has got this online image on the left. It's basically a panel in the middle and two uh, what we call cells or tubes on the side that fill with air, and you'll notice that the front edge is bigger than the back edge. So we have the Venturi effect where air coming in accelerates as it goes through a smaller area and it escapes out the back and it jets the kite upwards. And these kites can be soft, that is, no rigid spars at all, or they can have a couple of spars to keep it aligned. The photo on the right is a sled kite that I made, and you'll see pictures of it and, in fact, a little video of it flying. This was made from an old mattress cover, plastic cover. When you get a new mattress, it's got these big bags of heavy duty plastic, and I made that plus some building wrap tape. So that call sign VO1DR was my old call sign in Newfoundland. So I was interested to not only make the kite, but make it portable, which was another sub genre. And there are people that still do this as well. But basically, make the kite so small that you could carry it around with you easily. Here's that kite folded up and into a little coffee tub, like uh, a little red plastic coffee tub, 6 inches high and 4 inches wide. So that had the kite, the wire, and the deployment system and anchor all in one, and it weighed about a pound and a half. So when I build things, I often build them with a kind of a portable use in mind. The idea that you could somehow stick it in your pack and take it somewhere. Here it is deployed. This is in a field in Newfoundland. So the bright yellow cord goes down to an anchor. There's a big concrete block. Then the reel has most of the line unreeled off of it, and the line itself is a braided 100-pound test line. So this is way beyond sort of flying a kite at the beach as a kid with a little thin white line. This is bigger kites, much bigger forces, because they have to be able to suspend and lift, maybe a pound or a pound and a half of your whole antenna string. So it has to have enough lift, and hence a lot of the forces are big. So everything is kind of big and more industrial sized. Here's a picture. Now you can see this is blue sky, and in there you can see a distant kite, and there's a little video. We'll turn this on. This is what it looks like when it's flying. Okay, I'll play it again. And you can see that there's two motions here. One is a kind of a backwards and forwards figure eight, and then the other one is up and down. And the backwards and forwards is just the natural behavior of the flight characteristics of these sled kites. They're more or less stationary, but they do zigzag around a lot. And then the up and down is simply depending on the velocity of the wind. If the wind speeds up a bit, the kite lifts up, and conversely, it drops down. The consequence of this is that when you attach an antenna to the kite line somewhere, it's moving, it's swaying, and is maybe go down a little bit if the wind drops, or maybe suddenly straighten up and become taut if the wind picks up. And so you can imagine the impedances that the antenna is presenting change. And so your system is not static, it's dynamic. And so hopefully when it's properly matched and tuned, there's enough freeboard or leeway that if the impedances become mismatched and your SWR starts going wonky, you still have enough space before your transceiver is at any sort of risk. I've never had any trouble, but the point is that this is not even the antenna could even droop on the ground for a little bit and then lift back up again. So it's a very kind of dynamic situation depending on the wind. My current kite is, I've got it here. I'll show it to you later if you want. It's the plastic or the nylon bag is the drogue. That's the drag chute behind this kite. The kite itself is rolled up in a small bundle. Instead of a tub, I've got the kite line wrapped, carefully around this bundle. And then instead of struts, I've got scavenged tent poles that are, nest together with shock cord. So this makes the kite more kind of rigid and resilient, and it's much easier to pack around when it's all small like this. And when it's all bundled up, it weighs a pound, 11 ounces, and is something you could conceivably pack around if you're going somewhere, especially like a long trip, or if you're, uh, let's say you're on a long canoe trip somewhere in central Canada and you're on some little island in the middle of a lake with no big trees. Well, a kite would be ideal there. And so you could conceive of places where you could use this kite even in the boreal forest setting. Okay, here's a couple of slides on how to launch a radial kite, and it differs from your normal kite flying. You might find it interesting here. The first step is you find a strong anchor, and the anchor has to withstand maybe 60 pounds of tension when the kite is fully inflated and pulling. So it has to be a good sized tree or a big rock or some sort of a fence post or something. Then you lay the entire line out. And in my case, it's 250 feet, and the kite is laying on the ground unassembled in the direction of the wind here. Then you assemble the kite, number two. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see that cursor, Andy?
Just wiggle it, please.
Yeah.
I don't see it.
Oh, okay. I don't really have any way to point, but at any rate, you can see the little character there is assembled the kite and the drogue kite. At this point, if there's wind, you have to carefully kind of keep a knee on the kite because it tends to want to fill with air and take off. It's kind of self-launching. And so there's been cases when I'm on my own where it starts to swing off and try to fly and have to grab it and pull it back down and deflate it. Number three, you basically hold it over your head, fill those tubes with air, and the thing now is you can feel it lifting. It wants to go, and you let go, and it just rises up, and it flies straight up until it reaches a steady point. So number four is the anchor point and your line and the kite, and it's doing that zigzaggy motion. And hopefully, if the wind is steady, it just hangs there. So the ideal radial kite, you launch it and forget it. You don't have to fly it. You don't have to steer it. You don't do anything with it. It's just up there. It's like a sky hook. What you do is you observe the angle it makes with the ground, and that's depending on the wind speed. The higher the wind speed, the higher the angle. The sled kite tends to want to rise up, and as the wind speed drops down, it'll drop to a lower angle. The minimum wind speed for this is about 18 kilometers an hour. Uh, and then there's other variables there, but super low wind speeds, it won't take off, and it certainly won't be strong enough to support an antenna. Once you note all that, and it's bearing, so it wants to swing in some position and then hang there, and its flight characteristics, you look to see how it's behaving. Now you can plan your operational setup. Then you walk the kite back down, and in this case, you put a carabiner over the kite line and a string on that, and you walk it down. So you don't handle the kite line because it's, you would wear gloves anyway, but this is not a thing where you pull the kite in at all. You simply walk it down, and it's struggling here, trying to stay aloft. And eventually you have to kind of grab this thing and shove it down and deflate it because it really wants to go. Then you plan your operation, and the operation is basically going to number six, where you are aiming where your operational setting is. You know how long your antenna string is, and you kind of plan where you're going to hook onto this antenna line and create a vertical antenna of some configuration. I'll show you the next slide here. So here's an anatomy of a kite antenna, and we can look at all the details. There's lots of little rabbit holes to go in here. If anyone's interested in some of these details, we can talk together offline or whatever. But I've learned this through reading and doing. So here's the basic what goes on here. The main stake here, the main anchor point, is essential to make that strong. Then your kite line goes all the way up to the green kite there, say 250 feet for the sake of argument. The antenna string is the entire column of the antenna plus all the adjoining cords and strings. The full length I just call the antenna string. We'll call that X. So when in your operating position, if the vertical height of the string is the same as the horizontal distance, you have a 45-degree angle. And ideally, if the wind is such that your kite is trying to pull 55 or 65, you have a slight deflection at the point of anchoring of the kite, and that exerts an upward force on the antenna string. That's what you want. So it's the antenna string is under slight tension at all times. If the wind drops, then the whole thing starts to sag, and your antenna can slowly kind of sag, but then the wind picks up and it comes boink, it comes back up. From top down, the first thing is important is a failure point, which is a weakest link, a little piece of cotton string. And the point here is that if there's any situation where the kite wants to run away, like say the anchor fails or the kite line fails, this kite will go. It'll go off and fly like the wind. It'll go at the speed of the wind and take everything with it, including your antenna. And because it's a long conductive string, if that drapes over a power line, now you've got real problems. So what you want is if the kite wants to run away, you have this fail here, and the whole thing just goes in a heap right on the ground. So it's kind of a fail safe. So it's important to have that little piece of string. Then going down from that, we have a little bit of shock cord, and that absorbs some of the dynamic motion of the kite and keeps the tension more steady on the wire. Then we have an insulator. It could just be a little thin plastic thing. And then your kite wire, which is some sort of length of interest. I often use an end-fed random wire scenario, maybe 60 feet. And at the bottom of that, or you could have 72 or 84 or any of the good random wire length distances, as long as you have space. So you can see with a 250-foot kite line, you could probably squeeze, 100 feet of antenna string in there or more, and still have room for the kite to fly above it. It has to have a little bit of freeboard to move. And then you have a wire. Then you have some sort of impedance coupler that suits your wire. If it's a end-fed half wave, you want maybe a higher impedance transformation. If it's a random wire, usually a 9-to-1. Then you have at the bottom a cord that goes down to a stake, and that anchors the bottom of the string. So the whole thing is like a vertical, slightly tensioned array of cord plus wire. And from that coupler, your bit of coax goes to your antenna tuning unit and your transceiver. And your operating site is right near that spot. A couple of things to add. One is there's a little grounding array of spikes. I use little aluminum gutter nails that are 7 inches long, say 2 or 3 of those, all connected up to cord and then onto the grounding side of the ATU. That bleeds off the electrostatic charges that are developed when wind blows over wires or string. It generates electrostatic electricity, and that can build up and can be a real problem with your radio. Anybody who's worked around helicopters or any places where you have rapidly moving rotors, you always want to ground anything that's coming down from a helicopter before you touch it, because you can have a big honking arc of electricity and really shock yourself. So it's a real thing. And also what is recommended and what I've done is you put a high value carbon resistor right across the inputs to the antenna tuning unit. I put a 1 megohm, 2-watt carbon resistor. The sole intention of that is to continually bleed off the electrostatic discharge. It really has no effect at RF, and so it's sort of invisible, but it helps to prevent any weird behavior of that. So that's the string. And basically, where you connect it, remember this thing was laying down on the ground. The kite was laying down when you first connected up your wire. Well, because it's what's the right word? Equally sided triangle, it's 45-degree. The hypotenuse of that is 1.4 times the leg. So 1.4 times the length of your antenna string is the point along the kite line where you want to hook your antenna. When it's aloft, it will form the vertical that will form the at X distance away from the stake. So there's a bit of planning. If you know where you want to operate, then you need to plan where you're going to anchor the kite because it has to be back far enough to allow the kite to fly and the thing to drop. Many people ask, well, why don't you use the kite line as the antenna? Well, for the very reason that I said, if the kite line is a conductive metal thing, first of all, it has to withstand quite a lot of tension, maybe 60 pounds, and dynamic pulses when the kite's pulling. So the wire has to be fairly robust, be heavy. But also, if it gets away from you, now you have this big conductive snake going across the skyline, and you wouldn't want to be responsible for that. So anyway, that's a kite. If anybody wants to talk more about this, I'd be glad to talk to you. It works when everything works. Okay, the next adventure which used the kite was in the place called Mount Sylvester in Newfoundland. It involves a float plane, Andy, good.
Yes,
And
yes, it does.
geologically, it is a very interesting feature called a Inselberg or a Monadnock. It's a big glacial knob or a knob underneath a glacier. And my first attempt at a full scale kite antenna, which was a complete failure. So here we go. So here's Eastern Newfoundland. Those of you who've been to Newfoundland, here's St. John's out on the east coast, the red star on the right, and then the little yellow line goes up to, as the Trans-Canada Highway goes up to Gander. And Gander, a friend of mine has a float plane, and we flew 94 kilometers slightly west of south to a place called the Bay du Nord Wilderness Area. That's the kind of dark green patch. It's a very remote, completely isolated patch of ground that is mainly kind of glaciated flat lowlands and bogs and conifer boreal forest. It's great habitat for all sorts of wildlife, but there's no motorized vehicles go there. The only way you get there is flying in or snowmobile or a long hike. Uh, so we were having a float plane in and a long hike and a float plane out. So we had to have provision that the plane wouldn't start or we'd get stuck. So we had all the planning and the preparation for hiking and emergency supplies. I had written a more detailed article on this and went through all the hiking gear. That's like a day hike stuff there. I use the ICOM IC705 and it neatly fits inside of a plastic 30 caliber ammo box, which you can get at Princess Auto. It's very lightweight and super bomb proof. And I just literally, you can see on the left, I just slung that over my shoulder and that's how we moved through the woods with it. Of course, radio bits and pieces and another little haversack. Again, all the kind of normal stuff that you have as a portable operation. The only difference in the middle center is the ES grounding stakes. So those are my high-tech aluminum gutter nails with black wire attached to them and then a alligator clip that goes on the outer part of the BNC connector at the ATU, and that's how I grounded it. I used for battery pack. I used an array of nickel cadmium, not nickel metal hydride batteries, and I've since upgraded to another technique, but that was what I used back then. The kite was that I brought was the same kite, but had two long nylon tails instead of a drogue parachute. It had these 10-meter long nylon tails, and they worked well as well. I used a telescoping uh, pole, which was also a walking stick. This was a freebie. It was a thing that was on a school near where I lived, and it was for a bird scaring kite that had like a hawk swinging around and keep the seagulls away. But it had broke, the tip had broke, and the maintenance person threw it off on the side and forgot about it. And I grabbed it and resuscitated it. So in the middle top, you can see a little like a fishing rod that I glued on with a little swivel and placed a little pulley to put the wire through. The bottom is a plumbing fitting with a quarter-inch bolt tapped through it to make a spike for walking. And so that's my pole and walking stick. And then the things on the right are little guy ropes to anchor it out. There you go, Andy. A
Yeah, I love it.
plane. So that's the plane we took. It's a very common Cessna family. Um, it's mainly a two-seater, but you could, I guess, the three in there. The more people, the heavier, of course. And by the time we got ourselves in there and all our gear, it was plenty. And here we are flying in June of 2023. This is Kerry Noble. He's the pilot and my buddy, and we're flying about 500 feet. And this was a plane with dual control. So it had like I guess you call it a yoke, Andy,
Yes,
the
yes,
yoke in front of you and the two pedals, none of which I could touch. So I had to and I'm 6'6", so I had to kind of get in this plane and then get out of the way of all these things while he moved. The thing in front of me moved, but I didn't want to, impede his movements. So it was a bit of a jam, but we were going along. As we're going along, we saw plenty of wildlife, and here's one of the pictures we took of a pretty good sized herd of woodland caribou. So you'll see these larger white uh, images down. These are the adult caribou, and it's part of the Middle Ridge herd in central Newfoundland, which is the largest caribou herd remaining in the world. And so there's hundreds of them, thousands. And if you get the right day, you can see these great herds. It kind of looks like the savannah in Africa or something. It's wonderful. If you notice at the bottom of the picture, there's little white flecks, and also up in the dark bog area, there's little white flecks. These are baby caribou, and this is soon after the babies were born, and they're starting to get their legs. Now, all this crowd of adult caribou are migrating and moving, sort of walking at a reasonable pace to the upper left. And these little babies are left to kind of figure out, well, I better stick with them. Because on the right-hand side is a black bear just kind of creeping along, waiting for a slow moving baby to jump on and eat. So it's like National Geographic special happening. It's quite interesting. Here's the mountain we're going to. This is Mount Sylvester. It's an Inselberg, which is German word for island mountain, and it's a first of all, you can see in the background is a flat plain. The entire island of Newfoundland was glaciated, and in some spots, the resistant underlying granitic rock just refused to be worn away, and you get these little kind of like pimples underneath the ice of resistant rock. The entire flanks now this is a good sized hill. This is probably 250 meters from top to bottom, this relief. But you can see there's big, scallopy, swoopy curves along the flanks. This is where the ice was actually moving around and over this thing. So this entire mountain or hill was under ice at one point. So we landed on the lake behind us there, and it's called Star Lake. And we taxied up to the shoreline, and there's a little bit of a sandy beach in the kind of lee of the wind, and we just tied off the airplane and got our gear out and walked through the woods a bit, and then got on the flanks of that granite slope and just walked to the top. It was all open. There was hardly any trail. It was just open granite and boulders around. And at the top, we had this cairn, and this cairn was actually historically significant. It was built in 1887 by one of the first surveyors in Newfoundland, and is still there. And people add stuff to it, but mainly they add junk to it, like little lighters and matches and, you know, keychains and junk that's littered with little crap in there. But anyway, the actual cairn itself is still visible for miles. Okay, here's me on the flank of this Mount Sylvester. The cairn is on the right, and I'm trying to launch this kite. We've anchored the kite. We've stretched out all the kite line, and I've trying to fill it with air and trying to get it to go. It would fill with air and go up 5 feet and just turn around and come crashing down. And I tried this maybe 10 times in different spots, and it was just doing the same thing. I could not figure out what was going on because all the other times I've launched the kite in a flat setting, it just took off. I could almost carry me up with it. But this one, it wouldn't go. And it dawned on me that this is the reason. Where you have a big obstruction in a steady flow, you'll get these eddies and disturbance and downdrafts on the top and lee side of any obstruction, be it a building, be it a mountain, be it a sail. If you're in a sailing boat, you get disturbed air behind someone else's sail. It's bad news. This is why, because you are in these eddies. And my kite was relatively right here where a downdraft was coming straight on top of this. So there's no way the kite could take off. So what we did, we moved down the flanks of the hill. Here's the cairn up, the picture on the right, you can see the cairn. We moved down maybe, well, you can see it's probably 200 meters of horizontal distance. We kind of got into a different uh, wind flow pattern and laid out the kite, and it just popped right up. So here's the kite, with telephoto a little bit, and it's got these long streamers, and the kite is up there, and it's got 250 feet of line going down to our anchor point. Uh, Onto that kite, I attached my wire antenna, which I'll describe. But as a backup to the whole thing, in case it didn't work, I used my little hiking pole, which is 18 feet, and a great antenna called the HB9EAJ. Is a Swiss ham operator named Stefan, who's developed this 7-band end-fed half-wave, which is a fabulous antenna. And I encourage anybody who wants to check it out. It's a great design. And I put that up, and you'll see the results for the two. Operating position is a poncho on the ground with, here's the IC705 kind of perched in the ammo box. The yellow thing is the battery pack. And the gray box on the right is my antenna tuner. And the little blue box on the lower left is a homemade paddle. So that's where I operated. And here's a tale of two antennas. So I had 102 feet of wire. And again, I was not thinking this through carefully at the time. And I learned a lot in this. First of all, how not to fly the kite, and also how not to deploy the antenna. So in every failure, there's some wisdom, hopefully. This 102-foot antenna, I thought to myself, well, 102 feet is a nice length for, say, a doublet, and you could do an end-fed, wire. It'd probably be pretty good. Why not just use that as my kite antenna? And that was about the extent of my thinking at the time. And I had one 32-foot radial, which I just laid out on the ground. This was bare, dry granite. However, what I didn't do, which is in my earlier picture, remember the operating position was well separated from the anchor point. In this case, my operating position was right at the stake or the boulder where the kite was tethered. So as a consequence, when the kite went up, the antenna came out horizontal to the ground for maybe 20 or 30 feet, and then came up in a great arc and connected up to the antenna. So I was able to tune this thing with my antenna tuning unit reasonably well. I could hear signals. I could see lots of signals on the waterfall on the rig, but I called many stations. I got not a single reply, nothing. I tried everything, from my low power, say 1 watt, up to full power with this 705, which is 10 watts. I was trying to keep that down because I only had limited batteries and I didn't want to use them all up. Then in kind of exasperation, I switched over to the other antenna and immediately got a long QSO with a guy in Wisconsin, 2,660 kilometers away with 3 watts. And we chatted for a long time, and we were describing where I was. He was quite interested in the remote setting, but also the antennas. And we did a live kind of A/B comparison. I paused for a minute, disconnected the antennas, hooked it up, retuned up the kite antenna, and tried to raise him. And he basically didn't reply. And I went back to the other one, and he said, "Yeah, I could hear you barely above the noise, but it was nothing like the other end-fed antenna." So these are my thinking of why that kite antenna didn't work. There's probably lots of reasons, but I don't think I had sufficient number or length of radials for that length of a vertical antenna. And using that length for a vertical may not, and certainly isn't necessary for good HF communication in my experience since, where I can use much shorter random wires or quarter wavelength antennas for various bands. So I didn't need that huge antenna. I probably didn't have the right impedance transformation. I had a 49 to 1 connected in there, thinking that, well, an end-fed half wave. But again, I was not thinking, and I didn't really use other alternatives that I had. Most importantly, I think number three, I think that horizontal run of the first part of the wire that swooped up, the high current feed point is where the radiation is trying to happen. And that was either on the ground or a foot above the ground for much of, say, a third of the antenna length, and then it went up. So basically, I think I was just coupling very well to the ground. I could hear signals because the wire's up there, but I couldn't broadcast. I was probably just warming up the granite. And then possibly I had faulty connections in the kite or something like. But I think number three, in my opinion, is the reason it failed. So I'm trying to gather some good news from this. I did get a contact and I did learn a lot. And it was a beautiful day and we got a good hike out of it. Next one is Mount Peyton in Newfoundland. This is another Inselberg in central Newfoundland. Not as remote, but involved a long ATV journey and a hike. And this time I used a 60-foot random wire and it worked out quite well. I did bring the kite, but as you'll see, we didn't even deploy it. So in terms of location, here's that eastern Newfoundland again, St. John's on the right, Gander at the next star. And we just carried on a bit, and then you see a little bit of a yellow line. That's where we took off with our ATVs. And we had a 26 kilometers one way to get within 5 kilometers of Mount Peyton. Then we had to drop the ATVs and walk the rest of the way, operate 5 kilometers back, 26 kilometers back. And so that was a long day for doing that. So it only gave us about an hour and a half on top. Again, we had hiking, radio, and emergency gear all piled up. And this is what it looked like. Two of us, myself and a guide, a guy named Paul Wood, who had been there and knew these trails, which are unmarked and difficult to follow. So he knew how to get there and was also a safety companion to go with me. So here we go. And on the way, we see beautiful scenery in central Newfoundland. This is what you see if you go to central Newfoundland. A big, wide open, sweeping landscape with lots of rivers and lots of gravel roads and the endless mountain alder, which is this green bushy material which tends to want to creep in and completely cover over roads over time. The nice thing about Newfoundland, there's no snakes, there's no spiders, there's nothing, there's no cactus, and nothing's going to bite you or sting you or kill you. And so going in the woods is fairly benign. What's happening now is their ticks are coming to Newfoundland, so that's the worst thing that we can face. And in the middle, you can see there looming in the distance on this, that is Mount Peyton. That's probably 10 kilometers away, maybe 15, and we're en route with our ATVs. Now we're closer and we've dropped the ATVs and now we're going to walk through this bog and dodge all the pools. We're going to walk to the far end of that grassy spot or mossy area through the woods to the right of the flank of the hill around the backside and come up where that notch is on the skyline. That's a fault trace that has a nice straight avenue right up to the top. So it's easy walking. And this is the top, is spectacular, open view for miles and miles. Fantastic. And it was a glorious day in the first part of the day, but later in the afternoon, as an aside, there had been many forest fires in Quebec and also Western Canada, and much of the sky in Newfoundland was affected by the westerly winds. And eventually everything got hazy and kind of murky yellow, very peculiar. But the beginning part was beautiful like this. Here's in the distance, you can see just below this horizon, a kind of a snaky body of water. That's Gander Lake. And at the left side of that is Gander, way off, maybe 25 kilometers away. Here's Paul Wood, getting ready to help me set up my antenna. And we were looking kind of southwest. And so the Bay du Nord wilderness area where we were is off to slightly to the left. There's a whole lot of nothing out there. It's wonderful country. Here's the operating position on top. And so the setup is a classic kind of a lazy seven kind of wire setup, a pole, and then the coupling is just over my right shoulder. There's a white blob there. That's the impedance coupler. And then a wire goes up to the top of the pole and out to, on the right-hand side, you see a faint white. I wish I could point, but I can't. There's like two prominent boulders in a little white line. That's a walking stick, and that's the where we tied the end of the wire. Now, the reason we didn't launch the kite is that where we're sitting here is perfectly calm. It was like wonderful spring day. And just behind me, just that little lip is like a jet stream of air roaring up this mountainside. You could almost hear it just whizzing by. And the like you could almost crawl out there and put your hand in this like jet stream of air. There was so much velocity, it was probably 60 or 80 kilometers an hour, I would say, coming up past that edge. And all the disturbance and eddies would have been so profound that the idea of launching a kite in this fairly tight area was just going to be doomed. So I didn't even bother. Here's the operating position. This is that ammo box again, and the little green thing is the battery pack. And the little gray thing is the ATU and so on. And you'll recognize the IC705. QSOs, everything I did on this trip was CW. So I got three really nice contacts there. The first one was in Pennsylvania, and that was most of the powers were, well, they all were 3 watts. So that was 1920 kilometers. And, it showed the thing was working. And then I got a couple of contacts in Germany at 4,300 and 4,600 kilometers with this little random wire and a pole. So like it always blows my mind to get these long distance contacts with low power and a little compromised antenna. It's the thing that keeps me coming back. So the end-fed random wire really works. Obviously you need some sort of impedance transformation, and I've used a 9-to-1 homemade impedance coupler, an on sort of a thing, and to my antenna tuning unit, and it seems to work fine. We didn't do the kite antenna. Coming close to the end now. So this is a trip to Portugal we did in May. So this is some international travel with a little portable radio kit. These are some pictures I took. It's a beautiful country. If you haven't been there, it's well worth going. Kind of unique in Europe. It's got its own language and its own food, its own culture, its own everything. Here's a picture of it. It's kind of a rectangular shaped country, and you can see the stars there with numbers 1 through 5. These are the cities where I operated with the radio setup that I had. And we'll talk about those. So north, south, east, and west, including Madeira. Now, Madeira is the island that looks like it's close, but in fact, that's an inset. It's 1,000 kilometers away out in the Atlantic. It's off the coast of Morocco. So it's way south and way out in the ocean. And you'll see some pictures there. So for radio gear, I used a small little transceiver called the ATS V5. It was designed by Steve Weber, KD1JV. It's a little thing that fits in an Altoids tin. It's a kit and very limited run. And I just was fortunate enough to say, I want one. And before everyone else did, and I got one. A homebrew whip antenna. This was a larger whip antenna. And those of you who were at the show and tell one time, I brought some antennas to the coffee shack. This was the bigger one that mounts on the monopod. And this has a raised radial. I didn't bring an ATU on this trip. What I did, I'd read that by measuring certain lengths along your raised radial, and I'd use the nano VNA to check the resonance and the where it's well behaved. If you mark those, all you have to do if you want to change bands is just roll up your radial to that point, and then your whip and the radial resonate at that band. You don't need any transformation. You don't need any ATU. The problem is that you have to get up and unroll or roll up your radial. And then I had my normal 5 meters of small coax to the rig. I did put a little resistive SWR bridge, you'll see that, and I switched from these little metal hydride batteries to a a car jump starting battery, which I've got here and I'll show you later. It's actually a great little deal. It starts your car, it can power your radio, and it has a 5-volt output, so it can be a backup for your phone. So it's a great thing to have. It needs a little voltage controller to bring it down to operational voltages, and I had a little homemade key. So here's the setup and a park bench in Porto. So the black box on the right is the car charger, and the wires come out of that and go to the blue box, which is the voltage controller. And that's a little thing that I built based on the LM317 voltage regulator chip. It's an old chip, but it's cheap and works well. And then that feeds the green thing, which is the transceiver. It fits in the bottom of an Altoids tin, but the cover, you have to sacrifice the cover. So it's kind of neat, but it's a little fragile in that you have to kind of, there's a knob there and buttons. You don't want to bash them up, so you have to take care of it. The little silver top thing is the SWR meter. It's a standard resistive bridge with an LED. So I could adjust my radial and hit the key and see if that red light goes out. And when the red light goes out, the SWR is basically 1-to-1. And so it's allows me to kind of crudely tune this thing. The red blob is a common mode choke that I built just to, clean things up a little bit. I'm not even sure I needed that. The little blue thing on the left is a dental floss container to hold earbuds, and I built a little volume control into that. And then the little thing on the lower left is a paddle that I built into a little plastic tube gizmo that I found. So tend to want to build things rather than buy things. So some of it is kind of repurposed stuff. In Lisbon, we stayed, this is a classic, inclined tram or funicular in downtown Lisbon. There's beautiful cobblestone streets. Never seen so many cobblestones in all my life. And where we stayed was a hotel that was similar to this, is like a second floor balcony with these metal balcony rails. And I put my whip out there and I tried to put the radial on those. It was a dead loss. I heard a few signals, but nothing. I think we're just surrounded by reinforced concrete and nothing was happening. Things were better in Porto. So with this setup right here is a park bench. In the background is the Atlantic Ocean. So we're in a kind of a suburb on the Atlantic end of the Douro River that is an estuary there. And so there's salt water right behind me. And this palm tree on the left is where this radial is anchored. And you can see a bit of the black pole tied to the park bench on the left-hand side of the park bench, and a bit of the kind of canted over whip antenna. That was it. And with those, I made these contacts at substantial distances using, in this case, 2 watts. So these are plenty of contacts, most of them in Europe, and I'm not sure why that is, because we got some other contacts elsewhere. It might be that the orientation of the radial in this setup had some directionality, and where the radial was pointing was kind of Europe directed rather than west towards the ocean. Okay, let's go to Madeira. So this looks, it is beautiful, and it's at about the same latitude as Hawaii. So it's a volcanic island in this beautiful subtropical setting, and it's just gorgeous. If you can go to Madeira, it's well worth going. If you had one place to go, I would go there. It's a beautiful spot full of rugged hiking trails. It's not so much a beachy lay down and do nothing sort of place. It's more of a hiking and active We stayed at Funchal, which is the capital of Madeira. And one day I went down to the beach area. In the background, you can see the marina and there's the boats there. And then this big, long walking zone along the waterfront and parks and everything. And there's loads of places where you're off on your own. There's no one, and no one's going to go out in the middle of these big cobbly beaches. There's no place to lay down or anything. So I went out there where no one was and found this concrete kind of bunkery thing and tied off in a place I could sit down comfortably and set up the same setup. And again, just tied off the radial to a boulder on the beach and off we go. And I made some contacts, including Brazil at 6,200 kilometers, again with 2 watts with this little setup. So again, I just, in terms of distance, conditions were really great. This was on 17 meters, or sorry, 15 meters. So it's fairly high in the HF zone, and it was a good day. Here's Estoril, the last place, and here I am in the park, just a regular old park. And on the left, next to that tree, is the pole, and you can see a little bit of wire coming up. That's the telescoping whip. And so there's really nothing to this setup, nothing too elaborate. Just find a kind of an out of the way place and park yourself there. And I was getting some reasonable contacts. The takeaway message from this is that international travel with radio gear was no hassle at all. I had all sorts of paperwork. I had copies of my license. I had stuff in Portuguese. I had everything up to yin yang, expecting to be cross-examined at the border. No one said a word going into Portugal. No one said a word while I was in Portugal, and all these parks and urban settings. No one even batted an eyelash. You walk right by you, and you're doing this weird thing with these wires and radials. And it was just like live and let live. So is a great spot for radio. And, as we all know, if you can't get high and clear, get near saltwater. And it really worked for me. Okay, for all that success and enjoyment, let's go to Martinique, where I had a complete bomb of a radio trip. This was last December. And for those that are not familiar with where Martinique is, it's out here in the Antilles chain that includes Grenada and Barbados and all these islands you will have heard of. It's just off the Venezuelan coast. And it's a long way. I mean, the Caribbean Sea is a long distance. From Martinique to Cuba is about 12 to 1,500 kilometers. So it's a good distance in there. You kind of think the Caribbean is a tight little place, but it's stretched out. Here's a relief image of the island. The lower star is where we stayed. So it's a big bay next to Fort de France on the north side of the bay, and we were on the south side of the bay. So kind of north facing bay. And then a big volcano at the tip of the island where we went for a long hike, and I brought my radio gear. I had 5 different outings and I had whips and I had wires and I tried everything, high, low, near the water, up high. I didn't get one QSO the entire time we were there. So it was a complete bomb. So anyway, I don't really know the answer. I think it's the antennas I was using and the setups, as you'll see there. Maybe conditions. Wasn't really paying attention. Maybe it was a big solar storm for all I know. Martinique is very French. So if you go there, be prepared to bone up on your French, because there are literally plenty of places that don't speak a word of English. And, you have to use, sign language or write things or draw pictures or something if you have no French. Beautiful spot. The southern place where we were staying in our hotel was near a place called Point de Bout or Bout. Those of you who speak French will know that better. But it's this setting here. It was a kind of a peninsula of sand and rock that went out and had palm trees and the sandy beaches and the salt waters there. And in the distance, walking through there is an old fort that's slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. The jungle is coming back. They used to have armaments there and cannons to protect Fort de France, the capital. And here was my radio setup. So you recognize that same ATS V5 little transceiver from Steve Weber. The battery pack here was now 8 nickel metal hydride batteries. I kind of kept it low and low tech for fear that there would be some sort of problem with my high capacity lithium ion battery, charger, that they would say, no, you can't bring that in or something, and then I'd be without power. So I decided to keep it low tech, and the other stuff you have seen there. Well, the little blue thing on the bottom is a little touch keyer that is a capacitive touch keyer, and it's built into a tiny little dental floss case. And it's great because it's very lightweight and has no moving parts whatsoever. So you just, it's just a touch. And as long as you're conductive, it works great. Sometimes you have to lick your fingers just to make a bit of saltiness there. Here's the setup. So I'm at the point here, that's ocean water in front of me, and it seems like I'm in a great spot. This is the detail of the antenna. It's a little camera tripody thing. I brought that to the coffee shack and showed this is the base loaded whip. It's short. It's only 54 inches long, and I had a 13-foot radio coming out of it. I was calling CQ. I wasn't getting any calls. I checked reverse beacon network, and my CQ was heard in Cuba. So this was getting out, but I just wasn't making contacts. Then we went a trip up to this volcano on the north end called Mount Pelée, and it more or less goes up to 1,400 meters from sea level. So it's a fair climb. You could drive most of the way, say 2/3 of the way up, and park at a little restaurant and then walk the rest of the way. That's what most people did. It's quite a steep walk, and there's the trail on the left, and on the right, this is me with my compass sort of aligning with the skyline, and it has an inclinometer. You can see on the bottom right, it's showing 27 degrees is a typical inclination. So that's just like relentless. You're just climbing up and up and up, and the trail was of varying quality, so your legs were burning at the end. Yeah. Nice views on the way up. Again, this is looking out. We're at the north end, so that would be yeah, kind of southwest across the ocean towards Venezuela, I guess. Interestingly, and I'm going to go back, you look at that, you think, well, it just looks like little grassy shrubs. You should be able to walk across that like the sound of music, like just walking through a meadow. Not so. Everywhere on this volcano, and I think on many volcanoes that are in the tropics, there's this dense mat of vegetation. It's like a springy growth of, I don't know what it was, some sort of shrub that just grows into itself, is about 4 feet high. So it's more or less waist height, impenetrable. Like you could not climb through it. You could climb onto it, and you could kind of wade and stumble over it, but it's very difficult to walk off the trail here. The trail took us up to the right here on the lip of this thing. This is the edge of the caldera. The caldera is the circular or roughly circular structure that happens when a volcano finishes exploding and degasses and everything collapses, and you get this kind of circular collapse structure, and that's a caldera. This is relatively small. It's only a few kilometers across. Some big calderas in the world can be tens of kilometers across. They're giant. The trail, you can't really see it very well, but there's a little black line sort of dodging in the middle of that. And it's about 50 to 60 meters of elevation difference. But it's very steep at the top, and it was slippery, and the trail was closed. So we couldn't really go. This is at the caldera rim looking down to the base of the volcano, and then that trail you can see scratching up to the very tip top. Of course, some people said, I don't believe in signs. They went ahead and kind of climbed down on the bushes and were hooping and hollering and climbing up there. And in Martinique, everything's kind of loosey-goosey. So if you want to go break your neck, you can go break your neck. And what I did was, you can see in the distance, there's the volcano in the fog. I went to the ridge kind of behind, and there was a nice walking trail that could take up there. And this is my radio setup, as such as it was. First of all, it's on this on top of this springy brush because the trail was only about 8 or 10 inches wide here. So I didn't want to set up because there were other hikers. I didn't want them, to be an obstruction. So I went off the trail, but it was like climbing on a bouncy castle. It was the springy mat. Now, this black thing is my tripod, but it's up in the air, like it's jammed into this vegetation and it's all wobbly. And you can see a little bit of a guy rope at the bottom. I had a 52-foot random wire and a 9-to-1 impedance coupler and a radial. But again, I had no height and no trees and nothing. So these are more or less laid out on the bushes. Now I've read in some cases where you could actually lay antennas on the ground and get some contacts. But I think in those cases, they're running more than 2 watts. So I think the concept of a low antenna was worth trying because I pumped all this stuff up there. I was going to definitely try it. So here we are. I didn't try the whip, partly because it's too wobbly and I was running out of time. Here's the operating setup. Same equipment again, and a little bit of a nylon tarp here. But again, you're kind of climbing on this very spongy, loose thing. You had to kind of lay into this operating area. Like you couldn't stand here. Like if you put your foot there, you go up to your hip in these weeds, and you'd be stuck. So you had to kind of lay into your operating position. It was it was a disaster. So I was 0 for 5 in Martinique. Now, bouncing back from that, the best QRP contact I ever had was this last February in Deep Cove, where we were renting a house. And I made a little comment in the blog about this, just to recap here. So in February, 10 meters was smoking hot, and I had antenna set up there at this rental house, and I contacted this guy in Berkeley Vale, Australia, VL2A. I thought VL2 was probably India, and I was all super excited, but it turned out to only be Australia. Oh, darn. So I was running 1 watt. I'd run down the IC 705 just for fun to see what I could do on the bottom end of 10 meters. I had inverted L antenna with homebrew transmission line, and I brought some of that. I think it's show and tell as well. And this is the setup here. The photo on the right is our second floor deck, and there's the pole, and there's 2 legs, 27 feet long. This top one is sort of horizontal, and the bottom one is sort of vertical. It goes out some distance, and the window line was trying to bisect that. It went through a window frame, like just cranked open a window and passed it through. So there's no pass-throughs and no isolation and everything. I thought it was a dead loss, but it was just great. And this top leg is oriented southeast northwest, and I've read that the propagation from an inverted L is preferred broadside to the horizontal leg. Now the vertical leg would be omnidirectional, but the horizontal leg has a broadside preferred lobe, and that would be to the southwest. And so here it is on the left. You can see the yellow line takes me right down to Australia. 12,000 and some kilometers with a watt. So I was really happy with that, and that's by far and away the best performance I've ever had yet. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks very much, everyone, for that. Shows a quick picture. Last Sunday, we went up to Mount Finlayson, and I set up that pole, my favorite pole, and a little delta loop with a piece of wire and fed on the corner. And I talked to a guy on single sideband in Colorado, which was broadside to this loop. And so it seemed to be going where it wanted to go. And we had several people with us, and we all shared this great charcuterie board of delicacies there. Unfortunately, we didn't have any coffee. So that's it. So if there's any questions or comments, I'm looking for kindred spirits who might like to go out and throw a wire up in the tree and use some homemade stuff to make some contacts.
Well, that's a great presentation, Scott. It's a marvelous mixture of travelogue and amateur radio and QRP all rolled up into one. So So it was absolutely great. And I think Glenn would like to say a word or two to start off.
Yeah, once again, thank you, Scott. That was brilliant. Members who don't get in on these Zoom calls really should be here, especially if they enjoy QRP. And hopefully we'll be able to find some kindred spirits.
Yeah.
You certainly know your stuff.
Oh,
I'm not blowing sunshine, you know where, but clearly you know how to do it. So that's great. I would also like to thank all the members who've showed up this evening. That's great. Alan, who's toughing it out in Parksville there. Um, as I say, it's great when we get lots of members on these Zoom calls. I've taken some screen captures, and I'm going to put them up with a short little commentary up on the blog, which will be great. I'll also mention that Andy has recorded the presentation and that it will find a place under the events folder. That's where you can find all the previous videos, which is a great service to the membership. And the final thing I want to mention is that on May the 31st, Richard Godfrey is going to he's in England, he's going to make a presentation on the MH370 disappearance in the South Pacific off of Australia, and how Whisper HF may provide a solution as to where it is. And he's blogging every day, I believe, coming up with all sorts of information. So this should be great. Now, I just had to pull a date out of the hat. So I chose a Saturday, and Andy will be coming up with some more information, read the times and whatnot. It'll be the same link. I had to do that simply because in June and July, I'm going to have a challenge with cancer treatment. So I wanted to make certain I could get it's something going. So I chose this date as the best one for me, and hopefully the best one for you. One final call out to everyone. Do you have any questions or comments for Scott?
Now, Ram has his hand up. If he unmutes himself, he can go ahead.
Yeah,
Hey,
hello, Scott. Sorry, I don't have the camera today.
hi,
I can,
Rem.
yeah, it was very nice to see you again. Like when I first met with you in EMRC Radio Room, I was immediately known that you're something special. So thanks so much for this, this very unique and interesting presentation. Kudos. I have a couple of questions actually. Do you still have and use this kite antenna?
I have, yes. Yeah, I've used it a number of times just around my house in parks and so on, just to test out the flight and test out the radio, and it works. Like it's fine as long as, there's a number of variables that need to stay constant. You need a good steady wind that's sufficient and not too gusty. Any hint of lightning or storm activity, you immediately take everything down. So you want a sunny, high pressure day with some wind. That's what you want. And then you want space that is unencumbered by trees and structures like buildings too close, because it turns out, just as a rule of thumb, about if a building is 10 meters high, then 8 times that distance downwind will be disturbed by these rolling wind eddies. So you have to have some space that's more than 8 times the height of any obstruction in order to fly your kite. So you need a fairly big area. A big beach would be ideal because the wind's coming in off the ocean with no encumbrances, and that would be an ideal setting.
Got it. I have one more question actually. So since you you took your handheld to different, international, different countries. Did you ever require to prepare for any prior permissions or approvals, or did you just go without any preparation? Like I was told during my exam that we must take prior permissions if we are going towards Europe or somewhere, something like that.
Yes, yeah, I did. There's two things with that. There's two groups of countries in the world, and there's two types of permissions you need. For European countries and their satellites, there's one form, I think it's called a CEPT form, which is a acronym for some collective joint agreement between the licensing bodies that you're allowed. And so you apply for that. You apply through the Radio Amateurs of Canada, and you pay a fee, and you get a sheet for a certain time, and you bring that with you, and it shows that you A, are a licensed amateur, and B, you've applied for this. No one ever asked me for anything. I had all this stuff with me, but you could just play dumb and say, "Oh, I didn't know you needed a form." It's highly unlikely that anyone would bother you. The biggest risk, I think, is like a what do you call, like people who check your luggage. Those people seeing something
Yeah.
with a bunch of wires and a battery or something, and they think it's a bomb. And so what you need to do is have your license, have a notice on it said, "This is amateur radio equipment. I'd be glad to show you." Like, just be completely open and say, "I'd be glad to turn it on for you if you like," and show that it's a key. There's earphones, and it's not well, you don't even want to use the word bomb in that setting. There's no risk to this. But no one ever asked me, first nor last. I was ready. I had all the paperwork in languages all over the place, so whatever language you want to go, have something that's intelligible in that language. And I had it translated English and Portuguese, English and French. Never need to use it.
Got it. I was curious because you were carrying loose batteries, so I was like, you must have
Yeah.
been checked in. All
Yeah.
good. Thank you very much again.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh, Andy, you're muted.
Hopefully I'm not muted now.
No, there you go. Yeah.
I think it's probably time to start wrapping it up. And if there's urgent questions, we can hear them. Otherwise, I think I'd also like to say thanks again to Scott for a really exciting presentation.
Okay, you're welcome. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, there's my email, or I'll see you at a coffee shack, or you could find out through the club how to make contact, and I'd be glad to go out in the woods with anybody to play some radio.
Great.
And there will be a coffee shack on the 9th of June. So if you got questions and you want to talk with Scott, you can do it right there.
Right on.
Okay. Thank you again, Scott. It's been fabulous.
Okay. Okay, take care. Have a good night, everyone.
Okay.